Good afternoon, I believe, right? It's after 12, so good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. So I'm Aaron Bandzes. I'm a VCIO at Charles IT. I'm going to be wearing two hats this afternoon, right? One of them is going to be a moderator, and the other is also a panelist representing the IT side of the house. So for myself, I've been in IT for about 20 years and at Charles IT for about 15, and I've done just about every role at our firm, but the one I love the most is what I'm doing now. So as a VCIO, I work with business leaders on long-term planning, budgeting, cybersecurity strategy, and I've helped clients navigate incidents and ideally prevent them from happening in the first place. So I'm joined today by two people that I've had the pleasure of collaborating with on that same mission. So I have Scott Garcia, who's Principal and Professional Services Risk Advisor at Smith Brothers, and Greg Bautista, who's partner at Mullen Coughlin, who specializes in incident response and privacy law. So the goal today isn't a lecture, it's going to be a discussion. We're going to walk through a few key topics around risk, coordination, and preparation. So we want to leave plenty of time as well for questions from you guys. You're here to hear from the experts. So to kick things off, Scott, Greg, I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves and also maybe share what you're hoping the people in the room will take away from today. So let's start. Scott, Greg.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Bautista. I'm a partner with Mullen Coughlin. We are a law firm that specializes exclusively in cybersecurity, so it's the only area of law that my firm practices in. We were founded in 2016 by 13 attorneys. I joined in 2020 with my team from another law firm, and we're about 130 lawyers right now. So it's, as I said, it's the only area of law that we practice in. We deal with about 4,000 incidents a year. I'm going to show you some statistics, give you a sense of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I'm Scott Garcia. I'm with Smith Brothers Insurance. I specialize in cyber liability and helping companies manage that cyber risk. You know, I've graduated from the Harvard Enterprise Cyber Risk Management Program, got my CCIC down at Carnegie Mellon. So I spend a lot of time in this area and just helping businesses really put up proper controls to manage the risk.
So great, guys, and again, we're all excited to be here. So let's start with the big picture, right? So we're going to talk about what's driving the risk environment right now. So I think, Scott, we'll start with you. From your vantage point in insurance, what kind of events are actually triggering claims these days?
So there's two major claim trends that we're seeing on a routine basis. One is ransomware, right? We've probably all heard of ransomware and probably either been part of an event or know somebody that's been part of an event. And ransomware is really starting to mature at this point. We're probably at about version 3. Version 1 was really just an encryption event. They just encrypted your data, never really knew who they got, never accessed your data, actually added a layer of security, right? And then they would show you the encryption key back. Version 2 became more of an extortion event where they would port your data out, then they would lock you up. And they would say, well, if you're not going to pay us the ransom, then we're going to monetize the information we took from you. Either we're going to sell it on the dark web, we're going to call your clients and embarrass you, we're going to monetize it, we're going to get you to pay the ransom some way. And then version 3 came out where they said, well, not only can we hold data ransom, but we can start to hold things ransom, right? So we started to see like manufacturers, healthcare, anything that's online. The MGM breach was a good example of this, right? MGM said, we are not paying you the ransom. They said, okay, and they started, turning on and off the lights. They locked them out of rooms, turn on and off the escalators. They just annoy them because they're smart buildings, right? To try to get them to pay the ransom. So ransomware is probably number one right now. Close second is cybercrime. This is your social engineering, your wire fraud, your invoice manipulation. It's a crime event where they utilize cyber, right? Cyber in information language is data information, where crime is money. Money needs to be identified. So it's kind of a combination of the two. And the social engineering pieces is that they get you to send them the money rather than them stealing the money directly from you. They send you typically a false email to get you to send it to them. So those cybercrime and ransomware, I'd say, are the two claim leaders.
Yeah, I would agree. I've got some stats if you want to put them up on the screen. So as Scott had mentioned, the crime, the wire fraud, the losses, that's the most frequent type of event that we see. And as you can see over the the last 4 years through September of this year, it still is the number one event that our firm handles. So that involves both companies that just have email compromises, meaning someone got socially engineered or clicked on a link and gave up their credentials to gain access to the email environment. From there, they can do a number of things. They're mostly financially motivated, so they're going to look for information related to transactions. Can they get in the middle of someone wiring money or sending money and either spoof one side or utilize access to the account to send legitimate looking emails that say, hey, we're changing our banking information. Would you mind sending this payment to another place? A client of mine just this morning was telling me about how they had just internally within their own organization, one entity sending money to another entity. The bad actors got in the middle of that and managed to change payment protocols. So $95,000 out the door before anyone realized it. And by the time they realized it and got to the Secret Service, got to the FBI, it was long gone. So that's where insurance can also be helpful, is providing coverage for those types of losses when there's a cyber event at the heart of it. Ransomware, also very, very active, particularly this year. I don't know if it was just dog days of summer or whatever the case may be, but we were slammed with ransomware events September, August, even late July. One group in particular, Akira, has been very active, and they've been exploiting unpatched sonic wall appliances, the firewalls that companies use, and doesn't require credentials, doesn't require any special access. They just find those and they're in. What they're doing, taking down all these companies, and as Scott said, extorting them for money. The industry sectors that we see impacted, professional services consistently the top flyer. Probably because in some part they buy a lot of cyber insurance because of the nature of the information that they hold. Manufacturing and distribution has been probably the most heavily impacted industry that I've seen in 2025, just personally. I know our numbers are still leaning more towards the professional services and healthcare side, but manufacturing distribution, they're really trying to go after that downtime. Like, does it, because a lot of companies have backups now, which is great. They can restore quickly if they have those viable backups. But one of the things that, if you take anything away from this presentation, check your backups and make sure you know what it takes to restore them, because a lot of companies that come to me say, oh, great, we've got backups, don't worry about it. We get into the investigation, find out their backups are encrypted or they were deleted. The backups they have with a third party in the cloud, they can't get them back as quickly as they thought. It's going to take a couple of weeks. It's terabytes of data in some instances. So not only is your data down, your people can't work, on the manufacturing and distribution side, there's usually a little bit of time where they are able to function, but that's a week, 10 days at most, and then they're dead in the water after that. So that time frame in which it takes to restore backups is absolutely critical in getting the business back up and running. And we have to deal with telling customers, telling the stakeholders what's going on, and try to make sure that we're not putting the companies at risk by saying too much too soon. And then the last slide that I have for you. So this is an interesting look into the cost of ransoms and the cost of wire fraud. So this year we're already at 867 ransomware incidents. I'm not sure if that number seems shocking to anyone, but you don't hear about most of these unless there's a real public nature of the company. There's some household names that we deal with, and you may see those hit the news, but for the most part, these entities are just regular companies, not public companies, and they're getting extorted for millions of dollars in some instances. The threat actors will take information that they find on Zoom Info, and if you go look up your companies on Zoom Info, it's probably not accurate, but that's what they'll use as the starting point for setting a ransom demand. We'll engage with them to try and bring the price down if there's a desire to pay. But we're looking at whether or not companies need to pay because they don't have backups and that's the only way they're going to restore their data, or if they're paying for something like data suppression. Because what happens is they come in, they poke around the environment, they try to find the most valuable information they can, and then pull that out of the environment and provide you with a list and say, look at what we've got. They'll prove to us that they have it. They'll prove to us that they can decrypt the data if we need that. But they're really trying to leverage, this is called double extortion, that data in hand, because what they'll do is they'll leak it on the dark web, and if you're not out in front of the notice before it hits the dark web, you're going to start getting calls from customers because it's on the dark web. You can't Google it. It's not going to come up, but there's researchers that track all of these threat actor websites, and we'll take it from those websites and put it on X or put it on social media, and that's how you get exposed before you're ready. And we're also seeing a trend in lawyers on the plaintiff side looking for these types of publications and bringing lawsuits before they even know if any sensitive information is impacted.
So how often are you seeing a civil suit follow?
Ooh, that's a tough one, because if you asked me 2 years ago, it would have been probably around 10% of the time. Now it's probably closer to 50%. Some of it's driven by population size, some of it's driven just by a race to the courthouse. Hopefully no one's a plaintiff's lawyer in the room, but it's kind of ambulance chasing at this point, because they just have to monitor, they monitor regulator websites for publication of breaches. So if you're in healthcare, the OCR, the Officer of Civil Rights, will publish if you report a breach to them. Maine publishes immediately if you send something to them. So what we actually saw with some plaintiffs' firms automatically pulling information as it gets populated onto the Maine AG's website to create attorney advertising. And it looks exactly the same. I reported one with 40 people impacted in total, one Maine resident. And there was an article published that thousands of people were impacted by this small engineering firm in Nebraska or something like that. And trying to find plaintiffs. So they came and they go, what is this? It's just them trying to get to the courthouse first because they want to be lead plaintiffs to make the most money.
Both of you guys are saying pretty much resonating what I see on the IT side, right? I will always call out the human element of a cybersecurity posture, right? So a few things you guys touched upon, right? And we're going to talk about prevention in a little bit more as a continued topic, but definitely social engineering, dark web ID. We literally have some services because they're all out there now. It doesn't matter which one you use, but someone had their credentials pop up on the dark web, and 90 days later, right, then they got hit with an attack, right? So it's almost like clockwork. And so even some of the training and education, and I think too, we're going to talk a little bit too about multi-factor authentication, which is a no-brainer at this point. One of the other things too, Greg, that you had said was their backups, right? So actually always having a critical backup will be a huge conversation for today, but we absolutely have seen malicious actors delete or try to delete backup chains up into the cloud to prevent you from doing that restoration piece. So which another thing we'll talk about, right, is it's always changing. So the way that they're trying to get in, but it's always going to be, I think, more of that human element continued always.
Yeah. One other takeaway from this slide before we move on. Yeah. If you have an insurance policy, don't store it on your systems because that is another way that they'll set a ransom demand. They'll find your $5 million cyber insurance policy, and when you go to negotiate with them, they'll hold it up and say, nope, you've got more money than you say you do.
You're basically giving them the restaurant menu there on a silver platter, right? So I guess let's pivot into, God forbid, if it actually does happen, right? So we're going to move into if you are hit with an incident. Scott, can you share maybe a recent claim example that illustrates how disruptive these events can be? Like, what are the top claims you're seeing lately?
Yeah, so one claim we just had, it was actually an IT firm, not Charles IT. Actually,
that's right.
Not a very sophisticated IT firm, actually. And our client was a manufacturer, and they hacked into that IT firm, utilized those tools that they do remote access onto their clients, and our manufacturer being one of their clients. They utilized that in order to launch ransomware. So don't just think about your actual environment as your only attack exposure. You have to think about your vendor exposure as well, right? Because now, our client, the manufacturer, suffered a ransomware event due to their vendor, right? Due to their vendor's controls being able to get in, or their lack of vendor controls in order to get in there. So from a disruptive standpoint, they were able to shut down the entire system. So the production was down for a week before they ended up paying the ransom and getting the encryption back so that they started to unencrypt, and it probably took them 3 days, and they're still trying to get completely through it. But there are probably at least 2 weeks of downtime in the manufacturing environment, and they're still kind of struggling through it. So a lot of aggravation, a lot of interruption on there.
Yeah, I think, Greg, too, we're talking about Sonic Wall, not to call it a name or a brand, but just, right, there's always a vendor manufacturer, a piece of technology within your business or home even that has a vulnerability that gets discovered and then published, right? So a huge component, too, if you're not, is doing what they call internal or external vulnerability scans to exactly pick up on, where that target within your environment has changed or how they can get in through those ways. But Greg, in the first 24 to 48 hours, right, what are we looking at, like, legally and operationally? Like, where do companies stumble the most in those critical hours?
So this is where, one of the takeaways that, I want to make sure everyone leaves here with is incident response planning. Because where companies get tripped up in those, first 24 to 48 hours is really spinning their wheels, not really knowing how to respond. By having an incident response plan, you have that roadmap, you have my firm's phone number, you have your insurance carrier's hotline, you've got your broker's information, so you can get all the right folks together quickly. If you reach out to us and you don't have a cyber insurance policy, we still will help quarterback that 24 to 48 hour window to make sure we get the right resources in place. Where we see people stumble, they communicate too much too quickly, right? So they're down, they see ransom notes on their environment, and they're suddenly communicating internally and externally about a hack or a breach. Using those words have legal connotations. It can inflame concern when you don't necessarily know exactly what the true nature of the situation is. Your systems are down, but what extent was data compromised? Was there anything sensitive impacted? Is it something that's going to take 2 weeks to recover from, or is it something that perhaps isn't as severe? So what we want to do in those initial stages, get the right folks involved, make sure if you have insurance, you get them engaged, because there are, within each insurance policy, requirements that, in some cases you utilize pre-approved vendors on those insurance company panels. But they're all pre-vetted and companies that, we work with on a regular basis. Once that gets going, then it's okay, we've got the lay of the land, we've got the right people in place. Because we have the incident response plan, we have the right people in the room from the organization. A lot of companies will come to me and it's only the IT lead on the call, and I'm going, I need someone that can talk to me about the people side of things from the HR perspective, the communication side of things. I need someone from the C-suite to really drive the leadership of the organization forward in that response, because otherwise, companies that push it down to the IT person, they're not thinking about all the other things that surround just like getting back up and running, getting investigation done.
That's actually a great point. Like Charles IT, being an IT firm, we actually will make sure and help clients with an incident response plan. It's, to me, the equivalent of, like, you practice at your house. They tell you you're supposed to practice at your house, test your smoke detectors, and then tell everyone where to meet outside, but how often are you actually practicing that, right? So we're going to get into that as well, but when we're helping them write a plan, we're actually going as far as saying, here's the number to call to file an insurance claim immediately, get that done first, right? Who talks to media? Right? What is the public press releases that are surrounding it? Who is allowed to talk to media? So not just from an IT standpoint, but if there's an incident, there's going to be a lot of things to dress rehearse, if you will, right? In those policies. Raise your hand in the room if you know your business already has an incident response plan.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. What about, raise your hand if you know your business does vendor risk assessments on your vendors? Charles IT, raise your hand. But yeah, so we're going to talk about it too, right? But there's a checklist in front. We are going to have a Q&A, but so for those who have follow-up questions on that, we'd love to chat after. So
one other point to that too is,
please.
How important is it to, or when, maybe a better question, when should the cyber attorney be engaged?
Immediately. Yeah.
Why?
For privilege purposes, we serve dual purposes. We're called breach counsel because we can really quarterback the response in a crisis situation. We'll bring some order to the conversation. A lot of times people are running around, trying to do their best, but it's uncoordinated. It's not necessarily working in the right direction. It may be trying to bring things up in a way that you might be compromising the integrity of forensic evidence that we're going to need in order to provide legal advice down the road. So bringing us in early, gives us the opportunity to say, okay, everybody take a beat, and let's all, coordinate on how we're going to deploy the right resources in the right ways.
Yeah. But that should be the first call because you get that attorney-client privilege, so that's not e-discoverable as well. So the attorney should be the first call.
Yes.
That's actually a great kind of transition because we're going to talk a little bit now about cross-functional coordination. I know that's a big fancy buzzword, but how does everyone play nice together when you are in your kind of in need the most, right? In that moment of chaos after an incident happens. So I guess, Scott, from the insurance side, where do you see breakdowns in communication or alignment during that time?
So this is going to keep coming up. It's the incident response plan. This is why that incident response plan is so critical because you really need to know who is on my response team, who's my first call, who's my second call, right? Who is on my team in order to really reduce that period of restoration, get everybody on the same page, and you should be doing a tabletop exercise with this as well, right? So you should run a mock breach to make sure that you have all the right people and that you're not missing anybody and that everything is going to go smooth. That's probably the biggest mistake that I see is a lot of organizations don't have that incident response plan, and all of a sudden, like who do we call? We can't call 911 because they don't care, right? Who do we call? And you get that panic, and hopefully you run into somebody like Greg that can help you through the process.
Call legal, call insurance, call your IT.
Yep.
But always make sure you have that dress rehearsal and those numbers.
Yep. It's so critical, and that also should be similar to the insurance policy, not online, because you're not going to have access to it. So you should have multiple copies of that incident response plan as well.
I'm sure you have some horror stories, right? But what are some common missteps when those groups start interacting together under pressure?
I've already noted the big one, which is really quickly restoring, and we don't want to delay restoration, but we want to do it in the right way with the right resources and the right protections in place. So it's great. IT comes in, great, we're back up and running. Well, did you deploy endpoint detection response on your environment? Do you know you're restoring from clean backups? If you're using the same tooling that you had in place to scan the environment prior to the attack, you're probably in a position where you're going to end up re-extorted because you didn't do the right steps on the restoration side. Yeah. So bring in experts to be able to help with that restoration process, make sure the right protections in place is absolutely critical. The communication piece is the other one that we always end up having to have kind of come to Jesus talks with our clients about, because everyone wants to be helpful, everyone wants to communicate to their clients, they want to be forthcoming, and that's totally fine. We don't want to hide the ball, but we want to communicate in a coordinated fashion so there's one single voice speaking on behalf of the organization with a consistent message across all stakeholder groups. So if you're telling employees you had a ransomware attack, you can't tell your customers, oh, we have an IT outage, right? You can say IT outage on both ends, that's fine. But if we start sending mixed messages, there's loose lips in every organization, right? So it's going to come back to you that there's inconsistencies in communication. And the worst thing that you can do is look like you're not coordinated and you're not responding appropriately because of inconsistent messaging, even though everything else behind the scenes may be going fine. A lot of times, actually, it did bring up one thought. Take your insurance policy, take your broker's information, take lawyer's information, my information, put in your cell phone, break glass of emergency just in case you can't get access to your systems. Because these things don't necessarily happen 9 a.m. on a Tuesday.
Rarely.
They'll happen while you're in Cancun and on vacation and not having access to your environment. So that is the best way to get assistance quickly, is to have that information in your pocket. You just call a number and then everything will roll forward from there. Put the policy number there. That way that you're getting the right assistance.
Your incident response plan should be should be clear enough that you can follow it drunk at 2 a.m. Put that in the marketing quote. No, I mean, a lot of it too. Like our CEO Foster actually says about our SOPs. We just have to write them so nice and crystal clear that anybody can follow them. The thought I had was also talking a bit about when you're in the middle of this and talking about cross collaboration, because you brought up a good point too, Greg. I think, right, as a business owner, your top instinct is like, how do I get out of this? How do I get my production or my environment working as quickly as possible? Because a lot of people call Charles IT and they're like, I don't know what to do, right? And Charles IT is a bit like, breathe, we will help you, right? We have a whole team that's dedicated to this. Here's your incident response plan. Here's who the people are to call, right? And we help make sure they step through it. But think of it like a crime scene at the same time. One of the things that I see as a big risk is like, you're so focused on getting your environment up and running again, you do not absolutely want to overwrite the forensic environment. It's almost like I said, exactly like a crime scene on NCIS, but your backups are going to be critical. So when you restore, that's great, but you have to make sure you've preserved the environment so that if, say, the FBI gets involved, or insurance, or legal, you have in a sandbox environment now. You also want to be able to find that ingress point, because you want to make sure that you know how they got in. And there's tools that Charles IT has like SIM, right, that help recreate all the logs of all the various aspects of your network, because you need to absolutely guarantee that it can't happen again, right? So the metaphor, I don't know why this comes to mind, it's like you've killed all the ants in your house, but you've never sealed up them and how they got in the first place, and they're just going to keep coming back year after year after year. So I think it's really important to say that as a part of your incident response plan, and your IT people, you need to make sure they don't just say, I got it back up and running, we got it done, right? You have to know how they got in. You have to have all the logs and auditing performed and the forensic data after the fact to recreate, what occurred.
And it's also, worth noting, when you have a cyber insurance policy, there are lots of resources that come along with it. I mean, I think I'm great, but I'm not forensics. I'm not PR. Those are services under these insurance policies that will come very quickly to the table. So we will start within an hour of you reaching out, bringing in the right folks to have that conversation. Yeah, exactly. And partnering with IT to make sure that the restoration is done in coordination with the forensic collections and have everything really well aligned and well packaged.
Yep.
Well, I guess, let's switch maybe some gears to prevention. I think a lot of that's going to culminate kind of some of the stuff we've already said, but I would love to drive it home, right, in terms of what can leaders do now before the storm hits. So, right, Scott, if you had to give the leaders in this room 2 or 3 actions to take today, what would they be from a risk and insurance standpoint?
So I always say you have to manage the risk. The biggest thing is that you need to identify what is my risk, right? What is my exposure, and then how do I manage it? And I usually describe it as building walls of risk management. The first wall being the IT wall. This is where everybody focuses, spends thousands and thousands of dollars on the IT wall. It's an important wall, but it's only one wall in the risk management. The second one is policies and procedures, and really just creating those policies and procedures around data, the information security policy, the incident response plan, the bring your own device, the password policy, the AI policy is the latest and greatest one everybody's trying to create. Right? Managing the risk from a policy and procedure standpoint. The next would be training and culture, which is just training your staff on what's the latest and greatest things and what not to do, creating that culture of awareness and not punitive culture, because you want people to report if they click on that $5 gift card rather than to try to hide it. And then the last one is insurance. When they crash through all the walls, the insurance is there to pay for those expenses that you incur when that data breach happens. So it's really managing that risk as much as you can beforehand, I think is most important.
Greg?
We've talked about incident response planning. I'm glad to see most people have incident response plans in place. That's going to lay out a lot of the things that we've talked about ahead of time. The training that Scott mentioned, absolutely critical, because all those numbers up there, while it tells a story, it doesn't tell the story that probably 60% of those started with someone that clicked on a link, went to the wrong website, fell for a phishing email. There are the 0-day events where there's a vulnerability that gets exploited, but most often, especially on the business email compromise side, it's someone that just was rushing through maybe, clicked approve on a MFA request that they didn't make. Not to say that MFA can't be bypassed, because we've learned that apparently it can. So, it's a good additional protection, but it's not the silver bullet that's going to stop all threats from coming inbound. But having that culture of care and diligence in interacting with your IT systems, and doing things like training, phishing simulations, teaching people how to recognize AI deepfakes, because it's becoming more and more prevalent. We were talking earlier about a situation where there may have been AI utilized to spoof someone's voice. And for another presentation, I've got AI that spoofs my voice and my partner's voices, and it's pretty easy to put together if you put in a little effort. So the threats are getting much more sophisticated, and that training at least will hopefully reduce some of the risk.
It's I'm going to have to say it's the same, right? And we didn't compare answers before I asked any of these questions, right? But Scott, we're talking a bit about the IT wall, right? Like Charles IT and our team can absolutely build you the most Fort Knox of networks and tools and stack, but it's always going to be that human element that may cause some of your worst days, in many ways than one. But that is where that training comes into play, and building that acceptable culture where, I love Walmart gift cards, but you need to know how to spot that, that's the wrong thing to click on, or that you've accidentally now wired $2 million to the wrong accounts, right? So definitely user training. I am going to say multi-factor authentication, but Greg's right, like a lot of MFA can even now be circumvented. So there are services now, and even a thing called MFA fatigue, right? We actually had an incident where a CEO was sitting on the couch watching a Disney movie with their family, and their watch had to approve or deny. Didn't even think about it, hit approve. Now their entire remote desktop server and PII was compromised, right? So, but there are things that are now even being layered on top of that, but I still think multi-factor has to be a no-brainer. It's one of the broadest page strokes you can do if you're not already when it comes to accessing email, cloud systems, and even local infrastructure. It all is also going to boil down, though, to the incident response plan and making sure you're testing it. Not necessarily yes, this might be a shameless plug on the Charles IT side, but we do have a department whose sole job isn't necessarily IT infrastructure and day-to-day IT support. It's more on the consulting compliance side. So we do sit and do tabletop exercises, right? We literally have a deck of cards that we will pull out of and say, here's the scenario you're sitting in. We grill the C-level. How would your company respond to this, right? And we just go through a certain amount of situations. It'll help craft you writing your incident response plan. And that outputs a whole document that everybody agrees upon, right? And you will make sure that legal and insurance and everything all ties together very, very nicely, so that if, and God forbid, something does happen, you are prepared. That buffer tool and that plan is a must.
Forces you to also look at it every so often, because people leave, new executives come in, and we've seen situations where they put an incident response plan together 3 years ago. It's 50 pages long. No one's read it.
So it doesn't even work here anymore.
And like you're looking at the contact list, going, "Who are these people?" None of them are on the call. So,
That's a good point.
I think great in terms of just what are the steps that it takes. That's one of the things we want to make sure people have as a takeaway here. In addition, we have that checklist that's on the table that also inspires some good thought to bring back to your teams. We've covered the present, but everyone has heard the term AI. And we've always also heard, and the next question isn't necessarily going to be about AI, though I'm sure it'll come up. But I also want to take a quick look at where we think things are going from the experts, right? Cyber isn't static. Requirements are changing. Even on the regulatory side, if I may, right, we've seen on our manufacturing client base, things like CMMC regulations now take effect, which are sort of government sanctions when it comes to not meeting certain level of cybersecurity maturity. And I know HIPAA is also having certain conversations about starting to put that into place.
Yeah.
So Scott, where do you see cyber insurance heading over the next 3 to 5 years, right? Can you even picture that?
So, who knows, right? The thing about cyber insurance is it's a little bit unique in that because it's a new exposure, right? It's not like fire, fire's in a building where we've been, dealing with it and we have data and information, 100 plus year data. Cyber is really new type of exposure to businesses. So we don't have the data that you would have with others. So we're constantly seeing it change, and it's kind of still in the infancy stages that we're seeing it develop, and it changes by breaches. The SolarWinds breach, right, changed it. The NotPetya attack, right, changed cyber insurance. So just one breach can just completely change the market. Right now, from a premium, it's a soft market, which is great. It's pretty flat, but that could change with one breach in the future. But you're going to start to see the policies adapt as the exposure adapts. As AI starts to develop, you're going to start to see AI insuring clauses that are on there, or maybe exclusions that are on there for AI type of a thing. So it's a constant moving target. It's not something that's as static, and to the point where there's no standardization within cyber insurance as well, where you'll have ISO forms for all the other exposures, but cyber, there's zero consistency, not only from a coverage standpoint, from a definition and terminology. So that's what makes it very difficult when you're looking at a cyber insurance policy and trying to compare it to another one. It's very difficult because everybody's defining things differently.
Yeah.
So you have to see what happens.
That's why it's good to have a guy like Scott around. The clients will ask me about their insurance policies, and I go, I'm not coverage counsel. I have no idea what policy you bought or what it covers, but I'll tell you if there's something that you're asking me to do or that you think needs to happen that may fall outside of what we typically see, because it is a moving target. There's different coverages. For a while there wasn't coverage for betterment. You can't improve your systems. You can't replace your Toyota with a Cadillac. Now there's some cover for that. It's definitely an interesting for us to watch, because nothing changes from our perspective, but how it impacts our clients definitely does change the way that they react to an incident.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see how the underwriters react to it as well. One of the biggest fears of insurance carriers right now is that widespread event, right? So let's say Amazon Web Services gets taken down, right? So how many businesses would be impacted or unable to do business because Amazon Web Services is down? So that's dependent business interruption that's on their policy. So the carriers are afraid, hey, if that happens, we're on all of these claims. So what you'll see is you'll see co-insurance, you'll see sub-limits, you'll see exclusions. So it's interesting to see the insurance market's take on these types of breaches as well, and how what they see as the future risks that are happening and how they're trying to address it. And they all address it differently.
We see a lot of even client needs from a technology stack standpoint, right, be specifically required in order to get coverage. We've also seen clients that don't implement certain tool sets get denied coverage for cyber liability insurance. Charles IT has started writing into our agreements when we sign on with new clients, where we're also checking to make sure that they do have cyber liability insurance, right, before we partner together, and making sure that everything is fully covered comprehensively for both the client and I know Charles IT definitely takes that seriously on our end, being a service provider.
Yeah, and it's interesting from an underwriter perspective too, because they'll look at classes of business differently, and it's almost directly in proportion to the claims that they've seen. Some carriers will insure manufacturers all day. Others say we have too many claims. We will not insure manufacturers. It's really interesting. It's an interesting time in the insurance market, and it's probably why I love it.
I imagine, some of the stats that I have are driven by what's being written, right?
Yeah, right. Yep.
So,
yeah, it's interesting.
With that, I think we have the time now to kind of talk to you guys and see what questions or situations are on your mind, or maybe even where you just love a second opinion. So let's open it up. I don't know if you guys have any questions for Scott or Greg or myself. So anything you've seen in your company that you want perspective on.
That's a tricky question. So if it's a service provider, as we've seen, Move It and some of these other big, massive events where thousands of companies are impacted by one company's issue, the liability for the breach of information, so where there's a notice obligation, lies with the company that owns that information. So in that example, the company that was actually hacked will tell the company, hey, we had this issue, your data was compromised. The company then drives what happens from there, right? So they have to make sure that all the legal obligations are being met. Contractually, between the two entities, they can potentially force back to the company that had the initial event the requirements to notify on their behalf. But it's their duty to make sure that it's done legally. So under the state laws, there's data ownership clauses, which speak to how quickly a controller needs to notify an owner that their information was compromised. And then between the two entities, they would have to negotiate who is responsible for notice. More often than not, the company that got compromised in the first place will offer to do that on behalf of their customers or the business partners because of the relationship.
So when you get hit, your insurance is going to be triggered, right? And your insurance company is going to want ownership of the investigation and the response as well, right? Because they obviously can control costs that way. What they may do, like in that case of the ransomware event, is they might end up subrogating back to the company and try to recoup some of their money. But that would be the insurance company that's doing that. But your insurance policy is going to be the one that's triggered in that case. You want me to take that one?
That's all you.
So, all right. So it's a very difficult question. So prior to COVID, right, it was pretty easy because the exposure pre-COVID was we were concerned about people stealing our information and selling it on the dark web. So we'd say, okay, how much information do we have? What's the average cost of a breach? We multiply those together, it gives us a roundabout ballpark limit. But when COVID hit, they changed their tactics from stealing our data and stealing it on the dark web to ransomware, right? They found that it was a lot more efficient to go after the victims themselves and get the money. At the same time, ransomware also became software as a service. So you didn't have to create your own ransomware. You could hire somebody to do it for you, right? So those two vectors came together, and that's what launched the ransomware issue that we have today, right? So after the ransomware, where do you put your limit, right? How do you know if you have enough limit? You can look at the average ransomware claim, right? Which I think right now is about $350,000, $400,000 is the average ransomware cost to a small to medium-sized business, right? You could look at benchmarking. So you could look at benchmarking tools and say, okay, of my peers, and we look at the breaches of my peers, this is kind of what the benchmarking tells us, so we can use the benchmarking. And then sometimes it's just a comfort level to say, okay, this is what I think it would cost me if I was shut down for 3 weeks, so you can kind of ballpark it that way as well. Very difficult question. Typically what I see is people go in at $1 million and they're really putting their toes in the water, say, okay, I got $1 million worth of coverage. And in that renewal, we'll take a look and say, okay, do we feel comfortable with $1 million? Or should we increase that? And that's when we really start to dig in and figure out what is the true exposure, what is the comfort level? How much do we want to self-insure versus how much do we want to transfer that risk?
Yeah, I think it may be also helpful to note the costs associated, just from my perspective, because BI is a big one. We don't see the BI because that all gets adjudicated after the fact amongst forensic accountants and the carriers as to what that value is. It could be the bulk of the claim. From my perspective, our legal fees, forensic fees, they're not the driver of the cost behind a claim. Where things really start to escalate is large notice populations. So if you have to send a lot of notices out, consider it like $1.12 per person. So if you're notifying 1 million people, you're already outside of that $1 million limit if that's, if you just dip your toe in the water. Beyond that, data mining. So this is where if they take your file server, if you don't have a good data map and don't know what's in that file server, it could be really anything, and sometimes we have to send that data out to a vendor to process, programmatically search, and then actually get people sitting at computers, and you can get teams of 50 or 100 people spending hours going through this data to see if there's anything that's legally protected that requires notice. And that cost can be hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, and it takes months to complete. Beyond that, there's the regulatory investigations and the potential for fines and penalties. And then the increasing frequency of lawsuits, where whether or not there's actually a viable claim, a lawsuit is going to be filed, and more likely than not, at least in the current landscape, it's going to settle, and it's going to settle for at least six figures, if not more. So.
You're going to hit, with ransomware, what sucks about it is you're going to hit almost every insurance agreement. It's going to be notification, credit monitoring, forensics, legal, fines and regulations potentially, business interruption, the actual ransom if you end up paying it, crisis management because you're hiring public relations, and then the civil suit that's starting to follow behind it. And the reason I asked you is because that's the new trend that I'm seeing is civil suits are just starting to ramp up. After you get through that whole thing and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, great, it won't go away. I got to deal with the civil suit now.
There's obviously a lot to it. I don't know if that either gave you comfort or answered your question.
More gray hair,
But one thing I'll say too is also keep in mind on the IT preventative side, it's not necessarily going to make like your limits or stuff go down, but definitely maybe even some of the premium. So if you do show effort that you're taking good measure or investing in IT technology, that absolutely can correlate to like, hey, the insurance company's like, hey, I can see you actually are taking this seriously, and that can also help you maybe on the back end, if you will.
That's why the applications are critical, is because they're trying to figure out what controls, right? What's a good risk, right? They're going through that, and they're hopeful too, right? If you don't know what controls should I have in place, the cyber application is a great place to start because this is what the underwriters see as good risk controls because they want to know, do you have that or do you not have that? It's a good question.
I can't really speak to the broker side of things, right? Everyone has to go through the process of deciding what they want to place, and they would look back at what decisions are made. And again, I don't get involved in coverage. That being said, we do see where there's an outside IT provider that maybe had a failure. This really comes through the subrogation side of things. So the insurance company, assuming you have a policy, will potentially seek subrogation against the IT company if they can see from the claim that there is potential fault on the part of a third party. If that exceeds the coverage, then it's a cooperative effort between the company that had the event that was caused by the outside company and the insurance company to make sure that everybody's working in the same direction and that there isn't potentially double recovery for the company and that the insurance company is made whole to the extent they can be. Not insofar as to make you whole.
It'd be a suit.
Yeah.
You'd have to be sued, and then for them, Charles IT, it would be the technology policy that would trigger saying that you failed to provide professional services, right? Or you you failed to enable MFA, and then from an insurance perspective, it would be professional policy as well, where you'd be sued for failure to perform professional services.
This also, I think, ties back to the vendor risk assessment that you should be doing as a business, right? So regardless if you're with Charles IT or any other vendor provider or any of your other vendors that you do business with, right? Like even HVAC, right? A common attack vector is HVAC equipment in your building because they're not patching it, things like that. There's times too where what you want to do is like when your insurance company's coming around and asking you these questions or helping tailor your policy, if you're saying, hey, I do have a MSP, Charles IT, for example, we follow SOC 2, Type 2 as a cybersecurity framework, and we have to attest to that every 6 months that everything's buttoned up. I think that's also a great framework that if you're not already subject to like HIPAA or in manufacturing, perhaps CMMC, always definitely maybe adhere your company to a framework. Because if you go to an insurance company and you're like, hey, my MSP has these credentials, right? One more shameless plug to Charles IT, I promise, but I'm proud of it. But it's like we are also going and doing a CMMC level 2 compliance, even though we handle no government confidential information, right? Just because we can, because we do take that very, very seriously. But if you have a vendor who says, hey, I've done all my due diligence, here's my reporting on it, or you also do the same, I think it makes it helpful when you're either putting together what your limits should be, or if there's a possible risk of Sal being in that situation at all. If your vendor has done their due diligence and you've done your due diligence on them, I think helps as a part of that equation.
Yeah. And NIST is one of the more common frameworks that are out there.
Yes, CSF, right, cybersecurity framework.
But if you look at it from an underwriter's perspective, there's really 5 things that the underwriters look for to say this is like the 5 minimum things that you should have. Well, it's 4 5 that will identify you as a good risk. The first one is MFA. Do they have MFA implemented, right? We found that significantly reduces exposure to ransomware. The second one is encryption, right? Encryption comes in 2 forms. It comes in data at rest and data in motion. Data at rest is anything that's movable, laptop, hard drive, thumb drive. The reason being is that if that laptop is lost or stolen, that is deemed as unrecoverable. You don't have to do notification, credit monitoring. And then data in motion would be any confidential information that's being emailed, right? So it's kind of in motion. So it's MFA, encryption. The next one is patch scheduling, right? Install the patches as they become available. Yep. This one surprised me because I'm like, everybody does that. You know, the patch comes out, you put it on, you know. And then Corvus came out with a report that said 30% of the breaches were due to failure to patch. And I'm like, why is that? And I started asking the MFPs. I'm like, what's going on with the patching? And they're like, a lot of third-party software is incompatible with the patches. So we have to hold the patches off, right? And I'm like, hey, that makes sense.
You're not investing in your software to keep yourself future-proofed. You accumulate too much tech debt, and now you're kind of...
Yes, and that's exactly what happens, right? So, so that's patching, and then the next one is air gap backups. And air gap backups, obviously, for ransomware, wash and restore. And then the last one that's like a half. This is the one that I think is going to start to become mandatory is EDR, XDR, MDR, right? It's that watchful software that's out there as well. You know, so those are the 5 things that the underwriters really look for to say, you know, if you have these as 5 things as a minimum, you're a good risk. Right, that's what they like to see, and then they'll start to get into the other questions, you know, the policies, procedures, those types of things. Which is interesting with the apps too. Is now the underwriters are becoming less confident of the answers on those applications, kind of to Sal's point, right? And they're starting to utilize technology as part of underwriting. So you're seeing these scans and scan results and scan assessments coming from the carriers, and some of them are insurtechs where they do it themselves, and then other traditional travelers, Hartford, they hire third-party companies to run these scans because they're more reliant on the results of those scans than they are from the applications, which is kind of interesting.
You can have ChatGPT fill out those due diligence questionnaires. Just kidding. Any other questions?
What, that one?
I'm actually not familiar with.
The safe harbor is, I think there's 2. I'm trying to refresh my brain here. Yeah. One is the encryption, right? You get safe harbor if you encrypt your data because you don't have to do the notification. The second half of that safe harbor, oh geez, I'm trying to remember it. It's not coming to the brain, but you know, just kind of to expand that question. Is that every state has different state laws, right? And you're held accountable to the state law that your client resides in, not the state that you're domiciled into. So that's why a breach coach is so critical, right? Because how do I become compliant with all these state laws when things go sideways, right? And the state laws vary greatly from really East Coast to West Coast. East Coast, they tend to be more focused on risk management, where West Coast, it's more about let's put the power in the consumer. It's more like GDPR type of a thing, right? So you'll see these huge variances on how am I compliant. Actually, Massachusetts probably has one of the better ones because they have it's called the WISP, right? The WISP 117, which gives you a checklist. It says, if you want to be compliant with mass law, here's the checklist, right? And it's a great checklist that's out there as well. You know, so that's why a breach coach is so critical, and knowing what you're accountable for, just from a state perspective, right? And that's not to mention from a federal legislation or from per industry, you know, like financial, you know, New York Financial, and now HIPAA is going to come out with theirs, and you know, there's certain industries that hold you to a higher standard as well.
Yeah, the WISP requirements, in Massachusetts, it's not just a checklist, it's actually a policy that organizations are supposed to have.
Yeah.
So when we notify a Massachusetts regulator, they're going to ask for confirmation that you have a written information security plan documented. And they'll do that regardless of whether or not you're in Massachusetts or not. A lot of times companies will have enough policies for substantial compliance and will argue that if there isn't a formal document in place. But to the point of the safe harbor, it sounds similar to kind of the risk of harm analysis that we can do under various state laws, where if data was encrypted at rest, if it was protected in other ways, you don't have to notify, even though that information may have been touched or taken by a bad actor.
Did you do what was within your means as well? Kind of tugboat rulings, right? So it's funny because I have this argument with the underwriters, right? Where the underwriters will send you a non-renewal notice, right? When you had a breach, right? And I'll argue, I say, that's your safest risk right there, right? They just invested, they know the pain, they know everything, right? They're gonna make sure this does not happen to them again, right? That's my argument to the underwriter. The underwriter's argument back, statistically, they're gonna get hit again, right? And that's kind of what Aaron was pointing to, is you can invest thousands of dollars into your IT, into your safeguards, but it really only takes one employee to crash that all down, right? And if you didn't firm up that access point from the beginning too, it's coming right back at you. And that's probably why the actuarial numbers are the way that they are. And I sometimes win that argument, sometimes lose. So insurance is starting to become a lot more proactive than traditionally. It's a reactive product, right? It's there when things go bad. So what a lot of these insurtech companies, and now the traditional insurance companies are starting to follow them, is that they want to give you as much proactive tools as they can, right? Because they know that it's a lot less expensive to prevent a breach than to react to a breach. Right, so you're starting to see these risk assessments, the scans, and they give you access to those scans. They'll give you discount to implement MFA. They'll give you discounts to go to encryptions. They'll give you discounts for training for like KnowBe4 and these types of things. So they're going to give you access and discounts to tools to help you implement those risk management strategies to do everything possible to try to prevent a breach. So it's funny because last week I was talking with IT professionals in upstate New York for higher education, right? So they're always fighting, saying, you guys aren't giving us the support that we need to do the defenses, right? Your guys' focus is on how do we access the system, right? And giving everybody easy access to our system versus how do we secure our system? So they can never get funding, so they're always fighting for it. So they're asking the same question, is how do we justify this? How do we get the people that don't understand to understand, right? So, kind of my recommendation is look at the environment, right? Look at the news. What is happening around us, right? Who is getting impacted by this, right? Is our industry getting impacted, and how would it be impacted when things did go sideways? And then the question is when it does go sideways, and it sounds like you already kind of addressed this, how would that impact us, right? What type of reputational harm would we suffer onto this as well? And that's something that I think a lot of people don't think about is the reputational harm. It's not just responding to it, but it's, the news is going to get out there that this happened to us as well. The other thing that a lot of people don't think about is the internal threat, right? The employee threat that's in there as well, because you guys have a lot of intellectual information that's there as well, right? That you need to protect. So you have an employee theft that could be selling this information or utilizing this information in a monetary way or using it. A lot of people don't think about that internal threat as well. So you really you have to do a deep dive on what would happen when things go sideways and what's kind of happening in our industry. So there is a lot of overlap, right? Because cyber, again, it's new, right? They're still trying to figure it out, quite honestly. Right, so let's take property coverage, right? It's something that I'm struggling with right now because there's a gap in coverage. If you look on a property policy, you're going to see a cyber exclusion, right? So if your property damage was due to some sort of a cyber incident, it's excluded from your property. The cyber policy doesn't have property coverage, right? So there's a gap that's there that I'm trying to solve for, right? If you look at the cybercrime piece of it, right? So like I said, crime covers or indemnifies money. Crime policies indemnify money. Cyber is triggered by something happening to your data. It's accessed, denied access, altered. Something happens to your information, right? But in a social engineering, where they send you a false email and you send the money, that money needs to be indemnified, right? But if we took the flip side of that, exposure where the criminal purported to be you. They send an email to your vendor. They sent the money, right? You're not out the money, but they're going to come back to you and say, well, you're partially responsible for this loss because you failed to protect your email server, and that's how they pulled this off. So if you use your data, cyber maliciously against you, right, triggers a cyber policy. So in response, the carriers have put a little bit of crime coverage in a cyber policy, right? Just to make it muddy. So now you have two coverages. You have some coverage in your crime policy, and you might have some coverage on your cyber policy. So they're starting to do the same thing with property. You might find like your computer or your betterment coverage in a cyber policy, and you might actually find some of it in your property policy as well, right? So there's a lot of overlap that'll happen that's in there. Primarily what you want to look at is what's the intent of the policy, right? The intent of the cyber policy is to protect the information that you're responsible for. So that should be primary, and then the crime policy would become secondary, right? So that's typically how you want to look at it. And then, you get all these crazy other policies that come in. The cyber or the umbrella excess policies might drop down under silent cyber. So you will get a lot of overlap that happens in there. But primarily you want to look at what's the intent of my policy, and is it covering what my exposure is, what I want it to cover.
So I can say I very rarely see companies need to shutter or rebrand. I like to think we've done a good job for them in guiding their communications, making sure that the goodwill with their customers or stakeholders is kept as intact as possible. There will always be a little bit of attrition, but generally have not seen companies have to shut their doors. I can think of one instance in recent memory where not my client, but another firm's client just couldn't recover. They didn't have backups. They didn't have the option to pay a ransom to recover, and they were done, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I think the stat is an unprepared company, 85% go under if you're not prepared for it, right? Take a look at Jaguar Land Rover right now. No insurance policy. Everybody's watching that, especially the carriers are really watching that to see what the business interruption is onto that. But I would really not be surprised if they go under because it is a significant breach that they're going under. They're unable to turn the plants on, and it's been, 3 weeks? So it's interesting to see how that one plays out. Everybody's kind of watching that. They just did, a $3-4 billion bridge loan or something crazy, to try to save, But unprepared, probably 85% of businesses go up. I think that's what the stat is. And that's why it's critical to manage the risk and be prepared for it.
Thanks again, Scott, Greg, for being here. And thank you so much.